Coral reefs, colorful, pristine, and essential for life, often referred to as the rainforests of the sea, are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. They are not vast, as they only constitute 0.2% of the ocean floor, yet are home to almost 1/4 of the total marine biodiversity. In addition to the intrinsic value of the coral reefs and the vast biodiversity they host, they are providing us with essential ecosystem services. Over 450 million people across 100 countries live near coral reefs, hence are dependent on them for their livelihood. These ecosystems carry commercial and subsistence fisheries by providing habitat and food to commonly targeted fish. As well, coral reefs are providing jobs and business through tourism and recreation. The diving and snorkeling industry is a multi-billion industry, drawing millions of people to experience the beauty of the underwater world. With this being said, this ecosystem has an essential economical importance for society. Coral reefs can also help protect our coastlines by acting as a natural barrier against waves, reducing their force and therefore preventing erosion. Climate change is posing a serious threat to coral reefs. With rising levels of CO2 emissions from high anthropogenic pressure, the Earth is rapidly warming. It is estimated that the average surface temperature has increased by 1 degree since the 1880s. With a long way to reach the Paris Agreement on the 1.5-degree target, we might be looking at 2 degrees instead. A 0.5 degree difference might not seem like a lot, but it has a large impact underneath the surface, with our ocean absorbing heat at a fast rate. These important ecosystems are now in rapid decline because of massive coral bleaching events, and their future is uncertain. What is coral bleaching? To answer this question, we must begin with another question. What are corals? Corals aren't just a single organism. They are a collection of multiple organisms, an ecosystem with many small creatures working together in harmony. The creatures are called polyps. They are little jellyfish-like organisms, a colony of which can compose up to thousands of polyps all living side by side. A symbiotic algae known as zooxanthini is hosted by a colony, which gives them their beautiful, vibrant colors along with a source of food through the process of photosynthesis. Thermal stress caused by rising sea temperatures as a result of climate change leads to algae being expelled. This process of algae loss is called coral bleaching, as what remains is a pale white skeleton. Bleached corals aren't necessarily dead, as a lot of them can recover once the conditions improve. However, repeated stressful conditions for longer periods of time without time to recover will lead to the deaths of these corals, as they rely on algae for energy. Mass coral bleaching is a natural process that occurs every once in a while, but recently they've been occurring much more frequently and intensely due to extreme heating events and global warming. The long-term effect of climate change is amplified by pulse heat stress events such as El Niño. It is the warm phase of the El Niño Southern Oscillation which alters atmospheric circulation in the Pacific Ocean. It causes increased average sea surface temperature in the eastern Pacific Ocean, while it brings drier conditions in the western Pacific Ocean. This is heavily impacting coral reefs in the Pacific Ocean, and especially the Great Barrier Reef on East Coast Australia. The current issue is that these El Niño episodes are occurring more frequently than ever before due to increased greenhouse gas emissions. In the early 1980s, the interval used to be in between 25 and 30 years, but now it seems to occur every 6 years. This time is thought to be too short for mature corals to fully recover, since fast-growing species tend to need at least 10 to 15 years. Hence, the coral bleaching leads to fatal incidents. It has also been found that climate change has induced coral bleaching during the opposite phase of El Niño Southern Oscillation, La Niña. This episode is usually implying colder, wetter climate, however this does not seem to save the corals recently. Today, the average tropical sea surface temperatures during this phase are warmer than they were in El Niño 3 decades ago. In the late 1970s, global mean surface temperature abruptly started to rise, and the warming has continued to date. It is estimated that global mean sea surface temperatures has increased by close to 0.9 degrees Celsius, and that the increase over the last 4 decades is around 0.6 degrees Celsius. With that being said, rising sea surface temperatures have drastically increased the frequency and intensity of coral bleaching over the last 40 years. Almost 30% of corals have disappeared since the early 1980s, and up to 90% of coral reefs may be gone in the next few decades in the absence of swift conservation action.
If you look at the frequency of these bleaching events, that they seem to be coming now every couple of years. The first one I remember was in the early 80s, right? And we're doing work, but 98 was the one that really struck home. And then there were a few during the 2000s. Then we came to this period from 2016. There's been almost one almost every year or second year, right? So their frequencies increased. Now 2022 we have another big one during an opposite phase. So imagine if we were half a degree warmer than that. I think they'd almost be annual. And the very worst thing is if you have bleaching during a winter period as well. We're now into our third year, I think, of the La Nina, and we haven't had as much warm water coming down the west coast as we perhaps anticipated. And there's a great concern that there would be. Every event's different, and as global warming occurs, they're changing as well.
So how can we mitigate coral bleaching? One approach is to reduce local stressors such as intensive tourism use, water pollution, and overfishing. This increases the general health of corals and makes them more likely to survive severe bleaching events. Coral restoration is another take, which is an attractive tool for the management of degraded reefs. However, conventional restoration approaches will not be effective under climate change. More proactive restoration approaches must integrate future environmental conditions into project design to ensure long-term viability of restored corals during worsening bleaching events. Some scientists are working on a method on how we can combine heat-tolerant corals with coral propagation and reef restoration.
Most of the viewers know that corals are in decline globally, so what can we do about that? The first obvious one is to curb carbon emissions. So a lot of research is focused on leveraging the natural variation in temperature tolerance. So we know within a species that some individuals are tougher than others when it comes to temperature tolerance. So individual colonies might differ, same species, but there's the individual is different. So harnessing that natural variation is a thought that a lot of people are contemplating. So can we improve the success of restoration initiatives by selecting only the hardiest individuals? So over the last maybe 10 years or so, we've really seen a revolution in our ability to sequence molecules of DNA. So this is often referred to as sort of next generation sequencing platforms or high throughput sequencing. So when this technology came on the line, that really revolutionized the field of coral genetics, because now you can generate millions and millions of sequence reads at really cheap costs. From an engineering point of view, so a lot of restoration initiatives are limited in their ability to scale up, right? So one of the challenges with restoration is how do we scale it up to make a difference? Scaling any restoration initiative is sort of like the key for us to make a difference, right? Like there's one thing to restore a small patch reef off Exmouth, it's another thing to try and improve the overall health of Mingaloo Reef, right? Two very different scales. Originally it was like, how do we restore hundreds of corals on this stretch of reef? But now we're thinking, well, how do we restore billions of corals that are spread across the Great Barrier Reef? GMO is modifying the genetic code, so that's using technology like CRISPR-Cas9 or other more traditional gene editing sort of techniques to sort of go into the gametes, manipulate the genetic code so that the offspring are different. So that's starting to be explored in the context of reef restoration. So like thermal tolerance comes from the type of symbionts that they have, the type of bacteria they have, their history, where they're from. So it's not this clean trait that we can just sort of predict very easily.
Scientists are calling to action the need for change within society and the need to curb our emissions not in the future, but now.
The thing we have to do is reduce the rate of global warming or the rate of ocean warming, because that is what's causing these more frequent marine heat waves. I'm personally doubtful. I think we're going to exceed 1.5, but I hope we won't get up to 2. And that if we can maintain that and then start to stabilise the temperatures, don't continue the warming, because there will be a there's always going to be, when you stop emissions, there's always a the Earth doesn't stop warming instantly. I think most people understand that the real solution is that we have to stop, these increasing emissions and stop these heat wave, stop the frequency, that narrowing, we call the recurrence interval for these very sort of intense events. But that's what we have to try and reduce the frequency of such events, and stabilising Earth's emissions, stabilising the temperatures is the way we've got to go on that.
Reducing our emissions will allow the temperature of Earth to stabilize within the next decade, which will help mitigate the rising ocean temperatures. The future condition of reefs and the ecosystem services they provide to people will depend critically on the trajectory of global emissions and ability to build resilient to recurrent, high-frequency bleaching through management of local stressors before the next bleaching event occurs. This is the key solution to combating coral bleaching and preserving coral ecosystems. Coral reefs are the most diverse and valuable ecosystem and are home to a quarter of ocean's marine life.
So it's a really severe problem, and it's one that, you have to think coral reefs are really a fundamental, and the Great Barrier Reef itself, and I should say our Ningaloo Reef of WA, the Ningaloo Reef is the longest fringing reef in the world. These are I don't know if you've visited reefs, but these are fantastic living organisms. You can see them from space, and we've got to really preserve them, and they're at great risk, I should say. Yeah. But I do think there is hope for coral reefs. The 1.5 degree debate, I can even remember starting, that was in 2015 or 2014 or something. And then people sort of said, maybe we should worry, they were talking about 2 degrees, right? And they said, maybe that's too much, we should worry about maybe 1.5. But at the time they went bickering about it, we'd already gone up another 0.40, whatever it is. The Earth's temperature had gone up a fair bit in that time. People were debating what to do. It was almost a 10-year or 8-year period, right? I think there's general consensus that we really have to get on with the job of reducing emissions, and I think I'm encouraged by that, and I hope we can get to it within the next decade. Actually, I think I'm hopeful that we can stabilise emissions. If the whole globe responds properly, then I hope that we don't have to think about 2050 kind of limits, that we can get to it. I would definitely hope by the mid-2030s and the mid-next decade, but no longer than 2040.
I think there is hope for corals. I'd certainly like to think so, because I've devoted my career to studying them. But the things are changing, right? Like, we see this on a global level. Climate protests are increasing. Younger generation is fed up. So I think over the next 10, 20, 30 years, there'll be a lot of change. Corals are inherently resilient, so they've got huge populations. They're really genetically diverse. So genetic diversity is the fuel for adaptation. So in that sense, they have this capacity to adapt rapidly. But the issue is when year after year, summer after summer imposes those bleaching temperatures, and there's just no time to recover, right? So if we can sort of foster resilience the best we can, but at the same time not lose focus on the bigger story of climate change and curbing emissions, then I think there's going to be a lot of people out there that doom and gloom and the world's over and climate change is happening and we're all screwed. But ultimately, humans are capable of accomplishing really cool things. We just need to sort of shift that paradigm, and people stop voting with their wallet and start voting for their kids, I suppose.